Hello there and welcome back to Industrial Design Sketching episode 4. Today we're going to be going over rendering different sorts of materials, from the matte to the shiny, so we're going to be doing like metal things and perhaps some matte things, and showing how to render them in a different sort of way from each other. And this is important because when you're making your own product design sketches, you want to clearly show what sort of material it is that your product is made out of. So if you're making some toaster and there's a shiny part on it and you want to show that it's made of metal, today we're going to be learning exactly how to do that so that you can show off your product design sketches in the best way possible. So let's get into it and let's get into the techniques which are used to show that a material is matte or shiny. So here we have 3 cylinders lined up on the page, and we're going to be rendering each cylinder with a different type of material. Let's start off with the matte material. So first we have to explore how is it that matte materials receive light and shadow, and what makes it so that they look matte. Simplifying things in product design sketching is always the best way to make your sketches look reliable and quite accurate without putting in that much effort. So here's a render of a cylinder, and as you can see, if it's in space without any walls or anything to reflect the lighting, of course the side most away from the light is the darkest. If we put a wall behind the cylinder, we can see that there's bounce lighting coming off the wall and hitting the cylinder from the backside. That way we can show this in our product design sketching by simplifying it and just making sure that the shadow doesn't reach the backside of the cylinder. That way we're showing somewhat that we've thought about the bounce lighting instead of just drawing it and putting more time into it. This is exactly why we're putting the shadow not at the very edge of the cylinder, but with a small distance between it and the edge. Another trick is making the contour lines on the shadow side of the object darker than the ones towards the light. This way we're really showing with 2 different methods that this side is in shadow. In the same way we can shade the bottom of the object as well with a darker line. This way we see that this object is resting on the ground and has a thicker line to show that. And since the light is coming from the left, the side of the cylinder which is curving away from us on the other side also gets a bit of shadow. On flat planes sometimes it can be confusing to which side you can shade on, and it completely depends, but we can just make some sort of gradient to show that the light is coming from one way or another as the object perhaps gets lighter as we go away from it. Now let's add a shadow like we practiced in the last episode of this show. And this shadow we will be filling in as well with a gradient to show that the further away the shadow is from the object, the lighter it gets. So the shadow which is very close to the object will be the darkest. And we can do this all with just our fine liner. There we have it. That's one of the easiest ways to show which side that the light is coming from and how a shadow affects the object. And you can enhance this by using the gradients on the shadow and making the edges of the object away from the light a bit thicker in line quality. So that's a pretty easy way and pretty nice way to shade objects, I think, for a matte object. But now maybe we can go further and let's make a metal object. And this is something that many struggle to do with, but it's so gratifying once you actually get metal right that it's fantastic. It will really add a level of realism to whatever sketches you make. The best way to sketch metal, I would say, is look at how the real world is and try to translate that into a simpler way so you can sketch it quite easily. There's 3 simple things which actually sell this metal effect really well. And the first one is having very high contrast areas. So if we look at real metal objects like steel pipes, you can see that there's a lot of bits which are really dark next to a lot of highlights. And this actually shows that this object is quite reflective and shiny. And for point number two is to have gradients in your metal objects as well. And the gradient shows that it's kind of curving, or this object is moving away from the light and the light is hitting it in different ways. And the third part is where the object curves, the light and the shadows sort of curve with it. So you'll see this in the cylinder that we're going to do around the edges, how the dark parts don't just go straight and end there, but rather they curve along the surface. Starting off this metal rendering, we're actually defining the areas in which we want the point number three, like curving the light around the edges of this cylinder to take place and sell this metal effect in a really great way. Here we're also putting in a area which has really high contrast and making a guideline to start off where that should be. This edge we're also curving into the top of the cylinder so that it sort of flows with the curvature. For doing many of these high contrast renderings, it's usually pretty nice to be able to do it with a marker and stuff. So I'm starting off with a fine liner here, and then I'm going to go over these parts with a marker. But if you just have a fine liner at home, then I really encourage you to just try anyways. It absolutely works very well with final liners, especially if you go over your hatching a few times to make gradients. But gradients are much easier to do with markers, and that's why I'm going to do it that way. So I'm going to be using like a N3, N5, N7 marker, but you can just use whatever you have at home to get those gradients. And I'll be going here from dark to light. So then the blending gets a bit easier that way, I feel like, than if you go from light to dark. Since if you're going from dark to light, then you can just go over those areas with light markers to blend even better and make sure that the gradient looks smooth. Something that really sells that this object is shiny is incorporating the light bounce into the shadow. Because since this object is shiny, it will be reflecting some of its light onto its shadow, making the shadow which is closest to the object perhaps a bit lighter than the shadow which is further away. So yes, this was somewhat a demo for rendering metal. So the things to take into consideration are having high contrast areas, having gradients in metal objects, and making sure that the shadows and the lights flow with the volume of the object. The third and final material we will be rendering is wood. And with these natural curves that wood has, we also need to be rendering with your marker strokes in a natural way. So to do that, you can have several different gradients of marker or such when rendering wood. And you can copy also the grain structure of wood, how it flows in a natural way. So I'm going to be starting off with a base of E13 and then going over with a E11 Copic marker. So this is like a earthy tone, pretty good for wood. And then we'll be using a darker color instead as to make the shadows with. So the E13 gets gradually light or darker, and the E11 is a bit lighter, and then you can use an even darker marker to do like the darker wood grains in the wood. For example, like the first time we went over it, the E13 wasn't dark enough. So if you want to darken it up, make a more deeper look to your wood grain, then you can go over it once more. And this goes for all markers, like you can go over with the E11 as well to make it darker. But you can keep blending and working on it until you feel that you're happy with the standard of it. And of course, sometimes less is more, so don't forget to not overwork it either. So once you're happy with the shading, you can start the fun part, which is adding in the wood grains, and that really shows and sells this wood effect. I'll let the clip of me rendering this play in its entirety so you can try and replicate it if you would like. And the general gist of it is just trying to get your hand flowing and make these flowing lines just as wood grain is. Eventually, when going over this wood grain doesn't produce dark enough results, and you want the wood grain to feel a bit darker than what it is, we can move on to even darker marker and we go over those wood grain structures in a darker color. Welding the top of what has now become a log of wood, I decided to put in the year rings inside the wooden block as well. So that way the wooden grain rotates around the circular section of the block. This time we're rendering the shadow with markers instead of making a gradient with the fine liner. And the markers will produce a softer gradient and a softer shadow as well. So these are just two different looks. It's not like one is better than the other or anything. There's just two different ways of making good shadows with gradients in them. And that was how to make matte and shiny materials with an extra bonus material, which was wood thrown in there. Thank you so much for watching and hope you learned something new from this video. And I will see you next time. Goodbye. Don't forget to like and subscribe as well.